Our lessons this quarter are from Song of Solomon. Now, where is that exactly? It's one of those books you really don't get to very often.
After Ecclesiastes.
Which is right after Proverbs.
Which is right after?
Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Yes, indeed. Sometimes you have to remember the books of the Bible before you can find it, some of those little ones. John has had the opportunity to review with us some of the background of the Song of Solomon, and I want us to take a look at that again. But before we do that, perhaps our memory text this week, which was kind of an interesting one. I hadn't intended it that way, but this was an interesting text from the song, chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. Timing isn't quite right for this one, you know. This one should have been in the spring sometime. For lo, the winter is past. And this is a clue, of course, to the part of the world you're talking about. The rain is over and gone. The flowers appear on the earth. The time of the singing of birds is come. And the rest of the text, which was not in our quarterly this week. And the voice of the doves is heard in our land. Let's take a look at a little bit of history by way of reviewing once again where we come from when we get to Song of Solomon. It was probably written by Solomon, the third king of the Hebrews, who was the son of David, the successor to Saul. And before Saul, there had been a period of time when the Israelites were ruled by judges. But before that, when they came into the land of Egypt, out of the land of Egypt, by way of contrast, how many Hebrews left Egypt?
600,000 without counting women and children.
Okay, that's the traditional count in the King James Bible, based on a unit of organization which was probably not known in David's time. The actual count of Hebrews that left Egypt was much closer to 5,000 than to 600,000. Not a very big number, but much more reasonable when you think about what they lived through in the wilderness for 40 years. Can you imagine 1.5 million people living in the Sinai Desert? Hard thing to do. How many Israelis are there today in the entire state of Israel?
About 3 million.
About 3 million in the modern age. How many were living in the kingdom when David held his census late in his reign? Do you remember? It's there in Kings. Why don't you take a look? Let's take a look and see how many there were in David's day. Oh, by the way, how long after the Exodus did David reign? The Exodus was about the year 1400 in the 15th century BC, and David reigned about 950 BC, so he was king about 450 to 500 years after the Exodus, by the traditional counting. If we look in the book of Kings, 2 Samuel, and the I believe it's chapter 24, isn't it? I believe it's chapter 24. When David decided to take a census of the children of Israel. Now these numbers, by this time, are fairly reliable. This is in fact the unit of organization that is often applied to the books of the Bible which are so much older than David's time, and incorrectly. And Joab gave up the sum, this is in verse 9, and Joab gave up the sum of the number of the people unto the king, and there were in Israel 800,000 valiant men that drew the sword, and the men of Judah were 500,000 men. How big was David's kingdom?
About the biggest they ever got.
About almost as big as it got. At the end of his reign, the kingdom of the Hebrews was the largest that it would become, except for minor additions made early in Solomon's reign, principally through political alliances. David's kingdom, how big was it? If we were to plunk it down on the Middle East today, how big is it? All of Israel, that's easy. It extended far to the east, covered nearly all of today's present state of Jordan, far to the north, all the way to the Euphrates River, way beyond Damascus, up the coast, including most of today's present Lebanon, but skirting the coast above that area and well into the interior. It was an enormous kingdom. David was in his day, by the end of his reign, one of the most powerful men to stride the earth. He had quite literally conquered everybody that opposed him. He went everywhere and did anything he chose to do. If you take a look in the book of Kings, this is in chapter 5, this is how he was remembered immediately after his death by Hiram, king of Tyre, who was an ally and part of the reason why the kingdom of David did not include the northern coasts of Lebanon and beyond, because they were the property of Hiram, who was a close ally and friend of David. And Hiram king of Tyre sent his servants unto Solomon, for he had heard that they had anointed him king in the room of his father. For Hiram was ever a lover of David, a friend of David. And Solomon sent us Hiram, saying, Thou knowest how that David my father could not build an house unto the name of the Lord his God, for the wars which were about him on every side, until the Lord put them under the soles of his feet. But now the Lord my God hath given me rest on every side, so that there is neither adversary nor evil occurrent. And behold, I propose to build a house unto the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord spake unto David my father, saying, Thy son, whom I will set upon thy throne in thy room, he shall build an house unto my name. Now if you'll flip back to the 4th chapter of Kings here, and we'll take a look at chapters verses 22 and onward. This is a description of Solomon and his kingdom. And Solomon's provision for one day was 30 measures of fine flour and 60 measures of meal, 10 fat oxen and 20 oxen out of the pastures, and 100 sheep, besides harts and roebucks and fallow deer and fatted fowl. For he had dominion over all the region on this side of the river, from Tiphsah even to Azah, over all the kings on this side of the river, and he had peace on all sides round about him. There was a reason for that peace. His father had conquered all potential enemies. It's quite simple. And finally, and Judah and Israel dwelt safely, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, from Dan even to Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. One of the little things that the writer then throws in about Solomon. Notice this. And Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. 12,000 horsemen? Do you know how many individuals there are in the armed forces of the United States in 1992? About 1.5 million. This is a nation of how many people? We don't pay as much attention to these numbers as we did during the height of the Cold War, do we? How many people in the United States? Over 200 million people. In David's day, how big was his kingdom, population-wise? We just read it in 2 Kings. No, just over 1 million, 1.5 million men. Women and children, the count is unclear, but the figure is probably close to between 2 and 2.5 million people in the Hebrew sections of David's kingdom. Solomon's standing army included personal guards. Now these are personal guards. His personal or imperial guardsmen, 12,000 cavalry. If one reads very much about the ancient world, particularly in this particular time period, and you have to ignore the little story about Sennacherib and the 100,000 who died outside the walls of Jerusalem, a misapplication of that unit of organization again. Solomon had probably the largest military in the ancient world until the days of Rome. Now, of course, that was believed to be mostly story until, do you remember, not so very long ago, some digging in the Middle East uncovered a vast stable belonging to King Solomon, with stalls for thousands upon thousands of horses. Of course, the little stories in the Bible, the little bits of information about how gold was as common as, and silver was so common that not only had he the largest, most powerful, and because of the works of his father, peaceful kingdom in that particular epoch of ancient history, it was also by far the richest. In fact, it is said that it was uncommon for a Hebrew family during the era of the early and middle Hebrew kingdoms not to have slaves. Not to have slaves was uncommon. Servants in the Bible, but slaves. And who were the slaves? Captives from conquered and tributary nations. No big thing. Not in the ancient world. Saul's kingdom was not nearly so large. It was not so secure. It was not peaceful. And it was David who brought the golden age of the Hebrew kingdoms to fruition. It was his work that gave Solomon the opportunity to rest, as had been promised by the Lord so many years before when the children of Israel came out of the land of Egypt. Now, Solomon was a very interesting figure. In the ancient world, kings were revered. usually as gods. Kings did things in the ancient world that we find amusing or incomprehensible today. For example, in Kings it tells us how many women lived in the king's household. You remember how many there were? Let's see, I think this is in 1 Kings 11, I think, chapter 11. Verse 1, but King Solomon loved many strange women, together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, Hittites. And in verse 3, 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. Now, let's understand this, okay? This is 1 Kings 11. It would have been most unusual if his household had not included hundreds of women, all of whom were either official or unofficial wives. Anyone know the difference between an official and unofficial wife in the ancient world, time of Solomon? It says here that he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. What was the difference?
Were the wives all part of royal blood and the concubines weren't? Was that the difference? Or?
Well, that's part of the difference, yes. Wives were of royal blood and concubines were not, is the suggestion. That's part of what often occurred that made the difference. The official wives were often the relatives of conquered nations, tributary nations, allied nations, and it was almost incumbent. I mean, it was something you had to do in the ancient world. You could not do it. And so kings' households included often, in fact, more often than not, kings like Solomon and the great kings of Babylon and Assyria and those that would come after him would include very large numbers of women who were wives. Now, lest you be disturbed too much by that, the unofficial wives, referred to here in Kings as concubines, were in fact generally the women the king selected for himself. These were the unofficial wives.
So, would you say the greater the king, the greater number?
Almost certainly.
Kind of like some nations, the more cows you have, the greater a man you are?
Yes. Now was that a fortuitous comparison or just a coincidence that?
Really inadvertent.
Okay. Well,
Unadvised, the point is the greater man by the greater number.
Yes. Possessions were the measure of the man. Did I say were?
Well, again, maybe that's fortuitous.
What's changed from the ancient world to today? Well, I haven't 1,000 wives. But is prosperity still the measure of most men and women? It seems that we tend to focus on the number of things that we have, the possessions that we own. In Solomon's day, that included the number of wives and servants/slaves that composed the king's household, along with the size of his army. These were three very important measures of the prosperity and power of an important man in the ancient world. Now, there were 1,000 women in Solomon's household. By today's standards, how many wives did he probably have? Meaning, real companions. How many did David have, by the way? Well, wait a minute now. This was a man after God's own heart. Okay? Let's see. How many wives did David have? How many?
Wasn't about 6.
Did you say 6? 6 wives? How many sons did David have? You know, there's one very certain measure. We know he had at least 4 official wives. How do we know that?
They're named in the Bible.
Yes, they're named in the Bible. But beyond the naming, there was a great tragedy associated with those 4 wives. Do you remember what it was? Do you remember a story about 2 men and some sheep and the sentence that David pronounced on the... What was David's sentence on the taker of that young sheep? 4 times he would repay, and he would die. But God didn't take David's life. Instead, he required at David's hand the life of his first 4 heirs. The first sons of his 4 principal wives. Principal wives. Personal wives. David, I just got done saying, had accomplished what Solomon enjoyed. If Solomon had 1,000 women in his court, how many do you suppose David had? This is just guessing, of course. David was, at the time of his death, let's not forget, the most powerful king in the Middle East, having conquered everybody who had the slightest inclination to give him any aggravation at all, and a number besides. How big was his probable personal court? Hundreds. We seem to pick on Solomon a little bit about these hundreds of women. But it would have been remarkable had he not had that size harem.
One of the reasons his was so large was that the king's wives were passed down to the next king. And I believe we're told in some probably Jewish history that he inherited around 700 women from his father David.
Do you remember a little story in Kings? One of David's sons, Adonijah, came to Bathsheba after David's death and asked her a favor. Do you remember what the favor was? It involved a woman named Abishag? What was the favor that Adonijah asked of Bathsheba? If he could have that woman for his wife. Well, no. I assume that she was an attractive woman. David would not have selected her if she had not been. And she was, of course, a young woman in the old age of David. He was, how old was David when he died? In his 70s, which I'm finding is not nearly so old as I used to think. Elder Bradford is here, and I'd have to say that anyway, but I've found it to be true You know, I remember when my dad had his 40th birthday. Do any of you remember that? When my dad turned 40, I thought he was old. I couldn't imagine being that old. 40. But I'm 48, and 40 isn't old at all. You're just a kid. Are you calling me a kid? Okay. What was the problem with Adonijah's request? What was the symbolism involved in that request? The wives of the dead king became a portion of the new king's household. Not someone else. Having married a king, they were never free to marry anyone else. They were widows the rest of their lives. Now, don't misunderstand the relationship now. Those women became a part of Solomon's household. They were his protectorate. They became an official part of his household. It was his duty as king to protect and care for, and should he choose, although that would also have been very uncommon, almost unheard of, for them to become part of his personal court. But they became part of his household. So it is certain that some of these 1,000 women that we're talking about here were already part of David's court. Okay. How many wives did Solomon have? This is a trick question. Did you read your lesson? Did you study your lesson? Well, there was always a principal wife. Okay? But all of his wives were just as official, his official wives were just as official as any of the others, legally. That didn't mean that Solomon slept with all 1,000 women, by the way. I find college students who find that particularly interesting, but that really has nothing to do with anything here. If you would take a look at the Song of Solomon, let's see here. I think it's chapter 6. And verse 8. How many of the women in Solomon's court were probably selected by Solomon as his wives and court, the remainder having either been inherited or a political possession? We're in the song, chapter 6 and verse 8. How many? 60. Oh, that's a lot different from... Yeah. Well, no, it's not all just 60, though. Here we have 60 queens and 80 concubines and virgins without number. Virgins without number? What's that all about? Servants, ladies in waiting to the queens and concubines, to the official women of the king's court. They were served by hundreds of other young women. In fact, it was part of the upbringing of any proper Hebrew woman to spend some time at the court, serving in the king's household, just as it was for every Jewish male to, at some time in his younger years, to serve in the army, which was part of the king's household. Now, we're not talking about the great wartime armies that were assembled by the kings of Israel and Judah, but to the standing armies of the kings, the guards units, if you will, as they commonly became called in later years, the personal standing forces of the king. This was one of those things that a young man did, as it was for the young ladies to serve in the house of the king's women. So Solomon says here that his court was his personal court now was composed of about 150 women. A little bit different from 1,000. Now, this is probably early in Solomon's reign, and it is certain, just as this number is, that that number grew. But remember that that number 1,000 that we see in the book of Kings is inclusive. It is his official court. That would include those women which he inherited. Well, think about this now. The women of his father became his women, including his mother. Did you think about that? Bathsheba was one of Solomon's official wives. She was also the queen mother. We get all tangled up in ancient world relationships, as we tend to keep them rather straight, one at a time, official. Say, are there any religious groups that practice traditions similar to the ancient world today, relative to family relationships? Mormons, well, not officially.
Well, that depends whether you talk to them or the government.
Why, by the way, was it common for men to have multiple wives? Why was that so common in the ancient world? There were too many women and not enough men? Huh? What? The more people there were in your kingdom, well, let's be logical about this now. If there were more people in your kingdom, what was a consequence of having more people? A larger army. A larger army meant more war, which meant larger kingdom and more people and so on. Now, wars in the ancient world tended to be fatal. One was not hacked about with a spear or a sword, and often survived. So, let's see. If soldiers went to war and died, then what did you have to do back home? Make sure that there were a lot more soldiers growing up. And if a lot of the men went off and got killed, that meant that there were probably more women than men, and so naturally Didn't say anything yet about right or wrong, just the way things were. Why was David not allowed to build a temple? God said he was a man after my own heart and a man of blood. How do you reconcile those two? That's not today's lesson. Solomon, on the other hand, was described by remember, Hiram here said he had peace on all sides. Why again? Because David was a man of blood. Okay. Song of Solomon. How many of you have heard the Song of Solomon described as an allegory of the relationship of Christ to his church? Anyone here who hasn't heard it that way? Thank you. Let us grant for the moment, although it's fairly certain, let us grant that there is some argument about authorship. But if Solomon wrote this song, remember back in Kings it said he was a pretty prolific writer. Well, he had time to write, didn't he? How much did he write? Officially. 3,000 proverbs and more than 1,000 songs. You would think that at least one of those might have been preserved over the years for us to sing, and this is the one that was preserved. But if that's the case, what was this song written about? Relationship of Christ to his church? Let's just concentrate on Solomon and what Solomon was doing, okay? Let's not worry about the rest of us who would like to make something out of everything, okay? These Western minds of ours have certain problems that we live with daily. For one thing, everything has to be reasonable and rational and have a reason and a consequence. And the ancient world wasn't nearly so concerned about that. Some things they took as just plain so. What was Solomon writing about in this song? One of his wives. Probably the woman that he considered to be his wife.
Unique. NIV says unique. Unique.
Yeah. I got to do this. David. Who was David's first wife? Who was Michal? Saul's daughter. Who was David's second wife? Abigail? Who was Abigail? Huh? Nabal's wife, yeah, widow, yeah. Anybody read that story carefully? Who was Abigail?
It's not the Jewish.
Well,
Was she here?
she was Jewish, all right. Who was she? You better go back and read that story again. Make that your task this afternoon. Abigail was David's sister. Do you suppose Solomon had any sisters in his harem? Oh, look it up. You'll have fun with that this afternoon. Go ahead. Yeah, you take a look. Read it real careful. I'm not even going to tell you where it is. You bet. But this particular woman that Solomon writes about, what's her name, by the way? And some assumptions. One, of course, that's made in our Seventh-day Adventist commentary. I hope you didn't read that one when you were trying to figure out who this woman was. What's this woman's name? Oh, he uses a lot of words to describe her, doesn't he? But she is, what name is she given here? She's called the Shulamite. Well, it might be from the place where she is, but that word is a problem in that case because that's the same word that is Solomon's name. That's the feminine version of Solomon. So what we have here is Solomon and Mrs. Solomon or Miss Solomon or whatever you like. That emphasizes, and I'm sorry on occasion that the King James Version is translated the way it is because it doesn't provide the emphasis in some cases by way of its translation that it could otherwise. Writing this song about Solomon, writing this song about a woman that he calls Solomon, which was his throne name, even more sharply emphasizes the fact that this woman, of all the women in his court, was his favorite. As he refers to her over and over again in this book, in this song, as his beloved. Now, did anyone get a chance to examine this song? If you would look at something here, I'd like to show you a bit about Hebrew poetry. Would you look at chapter 4, verse 16, and chapter 5, verse 1. Okay. What does it say in 4:16? Anyone? Read it for us.
Awake, O north wind, and come thou south. Blow upon my garden, that the spices thereof may flow out. Let my beloved come into his garden, and eat his pleasant fruits.
Awake, O north wind, and come thou south. Blow upon my garden, that the spices thereof may flow out. And this phrase is the important one. Let my beloved come into his garden and eat his pleasant fruits. An invitation. 5:1. 5:1. I am come into my garden, my sister, my spouse. I have gathered my myrrh with my spice, etc., etc. An invitation and his RSVP. Invitation and response. This is the center of the Book of Solomon. Okay? This whole song is a Hebrew device that couples a pair of mirror images. In Greek, there is a character, chi. Does anyone remember what the letter chi is in the English alphabet? An X. The symbolism of the X marking the juncture of similar structures. And this point in the Song of Solomon is the crossover of the X. Everything which goes before is reflected in what comes after. This is the center of the book, or the center of what we call a chiasm. Okay? So let's take a look at this poem and see if we can pick out the pieces that reflect each other. If you go back to the beginning of the song, and start in verse 2 and carry on through the second verse of chapter 2, what we find here is a description of a woman and her feeling for her husband. Take a look at this. This is, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for thy love is better than wine. Draw me, we will run after thee. This is quite a little passage here. Okay, tell you what. Let's take a look over at chapter 8. We'll start around verse 6, okay? Set me as a seal upon thine heart, as a seal upon thine arm, for love is strong as death, jealousy is cruel as the grave. I am a wall, and my breasts like towers. Then was I in his eyes as one that found favor. And if you take this passage and refer back to the first 15 or 20 verses, you see something about the things that they say. They sound very much alike. Okay, let's see. We'll start with the Song of Solomon. We'll start with the third verse in chapter 2 and read on into to the end of that chapter. Let's see. As the apple tree among the trees of the wood, so is my beloved among the sons. He brought me to the banqueting house, and his banner over me was love. His left hand is under my head. The voice of my beloved, behold, he cometh leaping upon the mountains. My beloved is like a roe. My beloved spake and said unto me, Rise up. The flowers appear on the earth. O my dove, thou art in the clefts of the rock. My beloved is mine, and I am his. He feedeth among the lilies until the day break. Let's go over to chapter 7 of the song. And we'll pick up around verse 10. I am my beloved's, and his desire is toward me. Come, my beloved, let us get up early into the vineyards. Oh, that thou wert as my brother that sucked the breasts of my mother. I would lead thee and bring thee into my mother's house. His left hand should be under my head. Some of the same stuff. A little bit shorter, you notice. But if you read them carefully side by side, you find that they sound an awful lot alike. Now, if you start with chapter 3, by night on my bed I sought him whom my soul loveth. This is a dream. You pick this out very quickly in this passage. It's a dream. And then let's go look at, chapter 5. Earlier than back the beginning of chapter 5. I sleep, but my heart waketh. I'm dreaming again. And between those three passages and the three that follow are these two verses. One which is an invitation to the beloved to come, and the second is his acceptance, his response. So we have here a fancy poem. Did you ever write a poem when you were, did you ever write a poem to your lady when?
Very feeble attempts.
I know, guys, but
Rival to Solomon, I can tell you that.
let me ask, how many guys, when they were courting their lady, wrote or tried to write a poem to that woman? Would you raise your hands? Come on, guys. I know you did. Oh, you're going to sit there and not admit it, right? That's poor. That is really poor.
It's the Western mind. You'll have to forgive me.
There's something about poetry, isn't there, guys? You get to that certain point in a relationship and it's like you just, you can't say them. You know what I mean? You just can't ever seem to say the right things, And the next best option seems to be to write it down.
We had a fellow who wrote one once, but he made a mistake of getting up in the old MV, you remember?
Oh, yeah.
And recited it to her, and he never lived it down. So maybe that's why some of us won't admit. We're still afraid and trembling from that experience.
Yeah, it's there's something about this man-woman thing. Women love romance. Don't they, guys? I mean, now, women, anyone here who doesn't enjoy romance? Real romance. Huh? Isn't that what you really want from a guy? I mean, a romantic guy, right? Anyone disagree? Come on, ladies. Go ahead. Romantic guy, right? The kind who sings songs and writes poems and brings flowers and am I wrong here, ladies? Huh? Am I wrong here? Guys, what do you think about that? Songs and poems and flowers. Kind of embarrassing, isn't it? I mean, real men don't do this. Huh? Isn't it sad? This has happened to us. You ever notice how it seems like over the centuries the gap between men and women has gotten wider instead of smaller? The difference between what women seem to enjoy in life and what men seem to enjoy, it seems to get bigger and bigger, the gap.
So is the Bible ahead of us?
Is the Bible ahead of us? Was Solomon ahead of us?
What I'm trying to say is, in modern times, people come so far and look back on that.
But the good news is that we're going to come back to this, and it's going to be soon.
Have we come so far in the modern age that we need to return to ancient values? I think that's what I said. We need to return to the ancient values. Yes.
Very ancient values did not value a woman's abilities at all. They valued her as a possession. And I don't see that huge gap. Women want it, but men want it right now. Some of them are going at it. But basically what they want is individual respect and mutual accomplishment.
You're going to have to say that again now.
How far back do I go?
As far as you like.
The original or the ancient days, well, it's going someplace. The ancient days did not value a woman for herself and for her abilities. They valued her as a possession. And that was partly because of Eve and passed on down. But I think nowadays the gap isn't that far between the men and women because they both want to achieve accomplishments, but they want to have something great together. And I'll have to admit, I got my best poem on our 40th anniversary.
Could I add a word to that? Since the women's lib movement came on, I've been conducting a personal experiment, a little research project, without publishing anything about it. For the first time here today, don't tell anybody but your friends. Women seem to want to be independent and not have to lean on the man for strength in this movement. And so my experiment was that every chance I got, I would open the door for a lady or open a car door or defer to her as some of us older ones were raised to do, and be courteous and polite. And then I would step back and say, oh no, we're not supposed to do that now, are we? And without exception, every time the lady would say, oh yes, please, continue, do the polite things.
That's a different lesson. Part of the same stuff, though, I think, and that's part of the interesting, of what we find interesting in the Song of Solomon. For most of us, books like Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon seem often not to offer very much. I would urge you this quarter, I'm not certain that a quarter is needed, but let's try this quarter to look at the subject of the Song of Solomon, the love relationship between a man and a woman. Let's concentrate on that for a quarter. Something that should be a lifelong task, but let's work at it just for a quarter and see what we can learn about the relationship between a man and a woman who are in love and what we can do to renew our relationships, strengthen our relationships, make them richer, more romantic even. You see, when God was building the earth, He worked for 5 days, 5.5 days, and then He did His most important creation. With His own hands, not by speaking or thinking, but with His own hands, He made a man. Now, some have said that this was God's first mistake. Many of those are women. It is interesting to note, however, that God had not finished when He noticed that He hadn't finished, and said to Himself, you know, I'm not done yet. And from the man that He had made with His own hands, He once again, with His own hands, made a woman, a mirror image, a reflection of His original creation. See, as you read the book of Solomon, and we've described it as a chiasm, and it is, which is a pair of mirror images, they are not exactly alike. Most mirror images aren't. You notice that? One is backwards from the other. So it happens when you do it with mirrors. And so in this case, God's mirror images were not exactly alike, but they were made as complementary objects, a pair. The strength of one served the weakness of the other, and vice versa. Do you suppose that if we could restore our relationships as men and women, as husbands and wives, that we could, as a consequence, restore our relationship with our Creator? Would it be easier to be what He wishes us to be? Have a good week. Look up that story about Abigail this afternoon. We'll see you next Sabbath.
Oops. Huh? Good morning, Sabbath School. Good morning, Sabbath School. We're about to start our song service. We're gonna sing a couple, 2 or 3 hymns to get us going. Our first song will be hymn number 422. We're marching to Zion. We'll sing the first, second, and last stanzas. Hymn number 422. Everybody singing? Come we that love the Lord, and let our joys be known. Join in a song with sweet accord. Join in a song with sweet accord. And thus surround the throne, and thus surround the throne. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God. Verse 2, let those refuse to sing who never knew our God, but children of the heavenly King, but children of the heavenly King, may speak their joys abroad, may speak their joys abroad. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God. Last verse. Then let our songs abound, and every tear be dry. We're marching through Emmanuel's ground. We're marching through Emmanuel's ground to fairer worlds on high, to fairer worlds on high. Let's sing out the chorus. We're marching to Zion, beautiful, beautiful Zion. We're marching upward to Zion, the beautiful city of God. Okay, that warms us up. Our next hymn will be number 518, Standing on the Promises. We'll sing all 3 stanzas. Everyone singing? Standing on the promises of Christ my King, through eternal ages let His praises sing. Glory in the highest, I will shout and sing. Standing on the promises of God. Standing, standing, standing on the promises of God, my Savior. Standing, standing, I'm standing on the promises of God. Standing on the promises that cannot fail. When the howling storms of doubt and fear assail, by the living word of God I shall prevail. Standing on the promises of God. Standing, standing, standing on the promises of God, my Savior. Standing, standing, I'm standing on the promises of God. Last verse. Standing on the promises of Christ the Lord, bound to Him eternally by love's strong cord. Overcoming daily with the Spirit's What's the opening song? Okay, our opening song will be page 618. Stand up for Jesus. I will sing the first, second, and last stanzas. Shall y'all stand? Shall we stand for opening song? Everyone singing? Stand up for Jesus, we soldiers of the cross, lift high his royal banner, it must not suffer loss, from victory unto victory, his army shall he lead, till every foe is vanquished, and once the Lord indeed. Stand up for Jesus, the trumpet call obey, forth to the mighty conflict in this inglorious day. Put on servant against unnumbered foes. Let courage rise with danger, and strength to strength oppose. Last verse. Stand up for Jesus, the sun will not be long. This day of noise of battle, the next of victor's song. To him that overcometh, a crown of life shall be. He with the King of glory shall reign eternally.
Shall we bow our heads? Our eternal Lord, our loving God, we'd like to thank you for bringing us through a week of battles, a week of joys, and a week of sharing with people throughout our communities. Bless us as we go through the Sabbath day. Give us the blessing that you would want us to have. Be with those traveling. Give them traveling mercies, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Before I do give the reflections, I'd like to thank a couple of students that are presently enrolled at AUC for their kind services for our close of Sabbath school. The director of song service was Owen Brissett, who's presently here, and our pianist was Crystal Clark. Thank you again for being last-minute men. I was asked to give some of my reflections of what my life at AUC had been. I arrived at Atlantic Union College in 1969, a lot of years ago, and Atlantic Union College was the first Christian institution that I attended. So when I left my home in Bridgeport, Connecticut and came to AUC, I said, I know I'm going to be in a little heaven. Everyone had talked about how wonderful Christian education was. It was an experience that every child should have throughout their life. Unfortunately, that wasn't always the case. And I'm not going to stand here and reap a lot of sadness, reap a lot of woes, or even drudge up feelings that I know exist in my fellow classmates, or those that are presently here, or those that went before me. I do know that through my experiences, God allows a lot of things to happen, and they happen for a purpose. with these specific reasons that God has in mind, we must be patient. We don't always know why He has placed us in certain situations at certain times. I do know that God allows that so that there may be growth. Now, sometimes that growth is not always in a positive direction, but each person does grow from every experience that they have. My question would be to the professors that I had from 69 to 73, if they could look at my experiences and my classmates and say that each person grew towards Christ. If they could say that without one dismissal, one doubt, then they did their jobs. If they can't, then there may have been a problem in this Christian education. Everyone has to answer that question for themselves. But I do know, because of those same events, there are a lot of close relationships that evolved throughout my 4 years here, and I know it happened the years before I was here. I see a lot of people that stay in touch with each other from coast to coast, from continent to continent. And so I know there was growth in one direction. If only, since we're studying Song of Solomon, everyone could go by God's new and final commandment that we should love one another as He loved us, then I'd have no doubt that each person's answer to my previous question would be positive. If we are showing love the way that God intends us to show love. So therefore, my charge would be to each of you that are in the Atlantic Union College community, to each of the professors, to the students as well. As you study Song of Solomon this quarter, that you shouldn't only look at it as a marital or a couple sort of situation that God wants us to look at in terms of relationships. I think He definitely wants us to look at how we are treating one another. In last week's lesson, there was I underline a lot of the phrases as I study. And one that I want to close with and share with you is our attitudes towards each other comprise the fabric of our spiritual lives as much as do our acts of worship. One way we show love to God, whom we cannot see, is by loving those around us who we can see. Please keep those thoughts in mind as you go through your daily relationships. I invite the quartet to come and sing for us now.
Good morning, everyone. I shall try again. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. There you are. None of us had the joy of being alumnus of this fine institution, but it is a joy for us to be with you today. One of the songs that we have the joy of sharing when we do the work of evangelism is Ride in the Chariot in the Morning, Lord, and we'd like to share that with you.
I'm gonna ride the chariot in the morning, Lord. To ride the chariot in the morning, Lord. I'm getting ready for the judgment day, my Lord, my Lord. I'm gonna ride the chariot in the morning, Lord. To ride the chariot in the morning, Lord. I'm getting ready for the judgment day, my Lord, my Lord.
Are you ready, my brother?
Oh, yeah.
Are you ready for the journey?
Yes, oh, yeah.
Do you want to see my Jesus?
Oh, yes, Yes, I'm ready for the chariot, 'cause I'm ready to go. I'm gonna ride the chariot in the morning, Lord. To ride the chariot in the morning, Lord. I'm getting ready for the judgment day. My Lord, my Lord, I never shall forget that day. Riding the chariot to see my Lord. When Jesus took my sins away. Riding the chariot to see my Lord. He took my feet out of the miry clay. Riding the chariot to see my Lord. And then placed them on the rock to stay. Riding the chariot to see my Lord. I'm gonna ride the chariot in the morning, Lord. I'm gonna ride the chariot in the morning, Lord. I'm getting ready for the judgment day. My Lord, my Lord. I'm gonna ride the chariot in the morning, Lord. I'm gonna ride the chariot in the morning, Lord. I'm getting ready for the judgment day. My Lord, my Lord. I'm gonna ride the chariot in the morning, Lord. Ride the chariot in the morning, Lord. I'm going to ride in the chariot to see my
Thank you very much. Our early morning worship service this morning was given to us by Pastor Ernest Flowers, who is pastoring in my hometown of Bridgeport, Connecticut. I have asked Pastor Flowers to give us our closing prayer for Sabbath School today.
Could we possibly all stand, please, and reverently bow our heads as we close out this part of our service today, as we issue ourselves before the Lord. Gracious Father in heaven, this morning you came by our individual rooms, place where we have slept and touched us, that we may see and visit with you again today. We thank you for the touch of mercy this morning. As we have come and studied thy word, we ask that it will permeate our lives today and throughout the rest of our lives. As we bring this part of our Sabbath school to a close and prepare for the word to be spoken for the divine hour, we ask that the sameness that we have felt carry on over, that when the holy day is over, we can say it was good to have been in God's house today, is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.